Hi, this is Ellen from the Chili Dog, and today I'm working on a tubular ear warmer like this one, and I'm all done knitting, and now it's time for me to join my last round of stitches with the provisional stitches I cast on, and I'm going to be using the Kitchener stitch to join. So let me show you my work right now. I've knit my entire piece, and this is my last round of stitches held on 3 DPNs. And I've cut my working yarn so it's about 24 inches long, and I'm going to use this yarn to join the ends together. On the other end of my work, I have my stitches that I provisionally cast on, and they're being held onto a piece of working yarn right now. Before I can join, I need to do 2 things. First, I need to weave in this yarn tail on the cast on edge, and I'm just going to use a needle and weave it into the inside of the tube here. The second thing I need to do is divide my work onto 2 DPNs instead of 3, just to make it easier. So I'm going to do that, and I'll be right back to show you the next step. The next thing we need to do is we need to move these 30 stitches that are held on the waste yarn onto DPNs. And it doesn't matter which side you start on. So to do this, all you have to do is kind of pull up the waste yarn and insert the DPN parallel to the waste yarn through the stitch. And just keep going all the way around until your stitches are all on DPNs. And one thing to remember, do not pull out this piece of waste yarn until all your stitches are transferred onto your needles. If you pull it out too soon, and you make a mistake, it's really hard to pick the stitches up again without losing your work. So I'm going to continue around, and I'll be right back when all of my stitches are transferred onto my DPNs. When I got to the last stitch that's on my waste yarn, it was really quite tight. So if this happens to you, one thing you can do is, instead of trying to get the entire DPN through the stitch, lift it first just by putting your needle through it, and then lift the stitch onto your DPN. Then you can slide your DPN in, and once all your stitches are on your needles properly, you can pull out that waste yarn. And instead of just pulling one end, it's actually easiest to pull it from the middle. I'm going to actually use my knitting needle here to just grab that waste yarn and pull it out. So now both ends are on DPNs. One thing that will make the join easier is if we check the cast on stitches that we just transferred and make sure that they're seated correctly on our knitting needles. And what I mean by that is that the right leg of the stitch should be coming over the front of your needle, and the left leg of each stitch should be at the back. So let's look here. I've got a stitch, and I want the right leg to be at the front of my needles and the left to the back. So I'm just going to transfer it over like that. And here you can see what I mean. The right leg is coming over the front, and the left leg is in the back. The second stitch is already mounted correctly, so we're just going to slip it over. And then the third stitch, you can see I want the right leg to come over the front and the left at the back, and right now it's reversed. So we're just going to slip it over. Next one is fine, so we'll just slip. And every other one will be backwards, so you'll just need to remount it. So I'm going to continue along and remount all the stitches from the cast on edge, and then I'll be back. Now that all our stitches are mounted properly, we're ready to graft. So I put a needle onto my working yarn. We're going to fold our tube in half And this is the cast on stitches in the back. And this is my last round of stitches that I knit on the front. And you can see that the last stitch here is on this bottom needle. And before we graft, we're going to hook a removable stitch marker onto both the first stitches on this back needle. Then I'm going to hook one onto this first stitch on the front needle. And when we graft, you work in pairs. So first we'll work 2 stitches from the back needle and then 2 stitches from the front needle. And on the back needle, you're always going to insert your yarn needle purlwise into the first stitch and drop it off the knitting needle, and then knitwise into the second stitch, leaving it on. And on the front, you're always going to insert your yarn needle knitwise into the first stitch and then drop it off the knitting needle, and purlwise into the second stitch, leaving it on. So let me show you what that looks like. So we're going to just move that marker to the back, insert the needle purlwise into the front stitch and drop it off the needle, knitwise into the second stitch and leave it on. Then we're going to pull that yarn through, making sure not to catch it on any of our DPNs as we work. And pull. And then on the front, we're going to insert it knitwise into the first stitch and drop it off, and then purlwise into the second stitch and leave it on. And pull the yarn through. And take your time, just making sure not to catch that working yarn on any of the DPNs as you're going across. So let me show you again. On the back, we're going to insert the needle purlwise and drop a stitch off, then knitwise, leaving the stitch on, and pull our yarn through. Then on the front, insert knitwise, drop your stitch off, purlwise, leave it on, and pull the yarn through. And we'll do it one more time. On the back needle, insert purlwise, drop a stitch off, knitwise, leaving the stitch on, and pull the yarn through. And then on the front, you're going to insert knitwise, drop a stitch off, purlwise, leave the stitch on, and pull the yarn through. And again, just be careful not to catch on all the knitting needles as you're working. So I'm going to work to the end of these first needles, and then I'll show you what to do next. So I'm at the point that I have 1 stitch left on each of the needles, and you can see my join here is pretty much invisible. So now we need to turn our tube kind of inside out and transfer these 2 stitches onto the needles that are on the other side. So just be careful not to drop any stitches off your needles. Just kind of flipping the tube inside out. And then just make sure that you're sliding the top stitch onto this top needle. And you can be done with it. And the bottom stitch onto this bottom needle. And you can be done with it. And you're just going to continue the same way, grafting around. Purl the first stitch and drop it off the needle, and then insert your needle knitwise in the second, and insert your needle knitwise into the first stitch on the bottom needle, dropping it off, and purlwise into the second stitch, leaving it on. And then continue all the way across until there's no more stitches. So I've grafted all my stitches, and I'm left now with 1 stitch on each of these 2 needles. To finish up the grafting, we're going to insert our yarn purlwise through this back needle, then you can drop the stitch off the needle. And this is where those stitch markers that we placed at the beginning come in handy. So you can use the stitch marker to lift up that stitch, and then we're going to insert our needle knitwise into that stitch. And then on the front needle, we're going to insert our yarn knitwise first, and then we can pull out that needle. And again, we'll lift the front stitch marker and just make sure that the stitch isn't twisted at all. Right there it is, so I'm going to turn it. Make sure that stitch isn't twisted, and then I'm going to pull my yarn through purlwise. And at this point, everything is grafted, and you can remove these two stitch markers. And we have an invisible join all the way around. And one thing that you might notice as you're working, your stitches that you've grafted might be a little bit loose. And that's okay. If that happens, all you have to do is, starting at the very beginning of your graft, you're just going to gradually pick up one strand at a time all the way across the graft and just pull your grafting row tighter all the way across, and you'd go around all the way. And then to finish off the earwormer, we can't just cut this string because our grafting could get pulled loose at some point. So instead, we're going to duplicate stitch over our grafted row of stitches across here. And since it would be really hard to see on this, since our join is so invisible, I'm going to show you actually on a swatch that I made. And we'll use some contrasting colors. So once your join is complete, you're just going to duplicate stitch over that grafted row for maybe an inch or two. And all that means is you're going to trace the path of your grafted yarn. So you would go up and then under the stitch, and then down and under a stitch, and up and under a stitch, and down and under, all the way across until you'd reached your desired length. So let me kind of show you what that looks like. So I'm following this stitch up and then under that pair and pull it through. And then it's going to go back down and under, and pull it through. And you're just tracing the path of your grafted stitches across. And all this is doing is just to help tuck in the yarn and make sure it's secure so that your grafting doesn't come undone. Actually, I might do that a little different. I'm going to go down, across, like that. So once you have tucked in your tail on your ear warmer, like I said, probably for about an inch, inch and a half, just to make sure that this yarn is secure, all you have to do then is pull the yarn through into the inside of the tube and just conceal it inside the tube. And when you're doing that, you may want to, before you pull it to the inside, you may want to just trim your yarn tail so that maybe it's only like an inch or two long. It doesn't have to be excessively long. So just duplicate stitch across like an inch or so, inch, inch and a half, to make sure that your yarn tail is secure, and then pull it into the inside of the tube. So I hope you enjoyed learning about how to do the Kitchener grafting in the round, and I'll be back soon with some more videos. So until next time, happy knitting!